How's that?
That's perfect. This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. And we have with us at Wizard via Zoom, Cook County Assessor Fritz Kaegi. Hello, Assessor Kaegi. How are you today?
Good to be with you today, and glad to have all the listeners here today too.
First of all, Assessor Kaegi, tell us a little bit about what your office does.
So we're part of the property tax system here in Cook County. There are several different pieces, but what we do is what we call the equity piece. There's a bill that there's a certain amount of property taxes that have to be raised, $16 billion every year. This year, we don't determine that part, but what we do is we, through assessments, determine how that bill is divided up amongst all the property owners in Cook County. And the way we do this is by estimating the market value of everyone's property.
So there's the two pieces. So your office is one piece, and what is the other piece, or are there even more pieces?
There are even more pieces. I wish it was very easy and simple, but it's not for historical reasons. We have, first of all, the taxing bodies that determine the amount of tax that has to be raised. And that's largely for schools. It's about 2/3 of property taxes are for schools in Cook County. But then we also have villages. We have the county. We have water water district to clean our water. We have libraries. We have parks. Those are our taxing districts. Then there is another group that does assessments called the Cook County Board of Review. Then our Cook County treasurer sends out the bills and collects the bills. And our clerk calculates rates. So there are multiple different parties to the system.
Who calculates rates again?
The Cook County clerk.
Clerk?
So basically, yes. So the clerk gets the levy information from all of the taxing bodies. And then compares it to the assessments that we and the board of review create, and that results in rates, and the clerk determines those rates.
So the different taxing bodies, let's say that there are villages, so those villages would pertain to certain people's properties who are in those villages. For instance, we in Cook County, where most of our listeners are in, those property owners and business owners have to pay taxes that are levied by Cook County, and other counties don't affect them.
That's right. That's right. And school districts can only collect property taxes from the areas that they cover. And as I mentioned, 2/3 of property taxes in Cook County are for schools. And this creates great differences in rates because some communities have lots of property value. So the amount of money that they have to collect in property taxes from each property owner does not translate into a high rate. But other places, they don't have much property value. And so in order to properly fund their schools, the rates end up being high. And that is something that's true regardless of how we do assessments. So this is one of the things that we talk about as a deeper inequity that stands outside of the assessment system, but that is one that is sort of fundamental to why property taxes are so high in Cook County and Illinois.
When you say that 2/3 of the money that has to be paid, the taxes, so that's 16 billion. So 2/3 of that is about 10 billion. So you're saying that 10 billion goes to schools?
Approximately, yes. And it's about 2/3 in the suburbs, and then a little bit over 50% in the city is for schools.
Oh. So when you have made changes in the assessor's office, so what are you doing now that is different from what your predecessor did?
Sure. So if we remember that assessments are about equity and how we divide up that $16 billion amongst us, the key is really to make sure that there are no distortions in our assessments, that they all reflect the market values of property so that each person is only paying their fair share. What third-party studies had shown before we came into office is that there were lots of distortions and inaccuracy in that system. One study showed that commercial properties in Cook County on the eve of us taking office were about 40% underassessed, meaning that the average commercial property was underassessed and that everyone else had to make up the difference, that being homeowners. So one of the things we've tried to do is to narrow that valuation gap. And that valuation gap was troubling not only for the size of the gap, but also because it was regressive. So the more modest a commercial property was, the more highly valued, closer to market it tended to be. And then the larger the commercial property got, the more it tended to be underassessed, especially ones downtown. So this is one of the areas that we've been addressing. And this year is the year that we reassess Chicago. We've been spending the last 2 years on the suburbs, and we get to address this big valuation disparity in Chicago this year, just like we have been in the suburbs the last 2 years. The other thing that we've done to make the system more equitable from where it was when we came into office was on the residential side. On average, residential assessments might have been in the ballpark around market values, but it was very regressive when you looked from home to home. Regressive means, again, that lower value homes tend to be more highly assessed or over-assessed, is what third-party studies showed. And then more expensive homes, the highest value homes, tended to be under-assessed. And we've greatly diminished that regressive pattern in the last 2 years. We expect that to continue in Chicago. So what is this translated into for taxpayers? In the average residential property tax bill grew only 1% this last year, and that continued from where it was the previous year. The growth in commercial property taxes was greater because we've narrowed that valuation gap that was there before. And in Chicago this year, with our reassessment, we expect that to continue next year when tax bills come out. The other thing that we're very proud of, Trudy, is that we have worked very hard to make our assessments transparent. In the past, assessments were done in a black box. No one could say where they came from. It built a lot of mistrust. What we did is we did a lot of work to put our models out in the open and make them transparent. So we put our residential valuation models, the whole code, out there for the public in an open source language so everyone can see it. We put a lot of data out there on neighborhoods so people can research how we've come up with assessments in their neighborhoods. And sometimes, we're off the mark. We're about 230 people trying to value close to 2 million properties. And homeowners know their properties better than we do. So sometimes we don't get that right. But by putting all that information out there, it helps people to highlight where our model might go astray. On the commercial side, we have put out all of the main assumptions and key modeling drivers that we use for commercial properties. And again, commercial property owners can better understand where we're getting our values from. And again, if we're off the mark, we can, by drilling down, sort of highlight why we might be off the mark, and then we can make the system better. So that transparency was really important. And then the last thing I'd mention is that we've worked really hard to upgrade the services and technology that our office is using. So we first of all secured passage of the automatic renewal of the senior exemption in 2019. That means hundreds of thousands of seniors do not have to reaffirm every year that they're still over 65 while having to come to our office and submit paper that could be transmitting virus or could be get lost. This way now they're automatically renewed. We have online appeals now. So that's reducing the paper flow. It's much more convenient for people. We have online exemptions. You can apply for exemptions online. You can make an appointment at the office instead of having to stand in line. So it's really gotten lines down. It's very convenient for people. Just to come to our office at the appointed time. You get the undivided attention of one of our associates, and then you can be on your way and go about your business. While not standing in line, especially at a time when it's dangerous to be out there with the pandemic. And lastly, we have a whole new website and a call center, so we're much more responsive. It's much more useful for people. So we've traveled really a long way years worth of progress in just the couple of years we've been in office.
When you start assessing like 1/3 of the map, let's say, then at what point of the year, in like last year, do you start assessing for this year? How long does it take to send out all these assessments? Like how many months of work do you have to do, or is it an ongoing process that's continuous?
This is a great question. It is basically, we have an annual cycle, but that has components that are constantly ongoing. So the first year we came into office, 2019, we reassessed the north suburbs. So this is all the suburbs north of North Avenue. And what we did there is send out assessments, and we send them out township by township. And then people get a chance to appeal. So then we'll gather together appeals once 30 days have passed after we notified people of their reassessment. So we're sending out notices while we are taking appeals, and there's always valuation work that goes into the assessments each year. So our analysts are working at that, and there's field work going out and visiting building permits. And so all of that is ongoing, and that continues throughout the year. We usually wrap this up around December, and then the next year starts. But of course, there are things from, when in 2019, we were planning to assess the south suburbs in 2020. We had some members of our team preparing for that by creating models, gathering data. So there's always an ongoing process each year, but each year it's the part of the county that we're reassessing sets the tone. So 2019, we were assessing the north suburbs, 2020, the south and western suburbs, and this year, 2021, is the city of Chicago. And it affects people's taxes the following year. So folks in Chicago who are get their assessment notices, it'll only affect their taxes in the second half of 2022.
And for the commercials properties, they were under assessed 40%. So now on the average, do you have a figure about what the level of assessment is for the commercial properties?
Great question. Remember, we're only assessing 1/3 of the county at a time.
Mm-hmm.
So when we reassessed the north suburbs in 2019, we saw that valuation gap, which again is just an average. For smaller properties, the gap might be much smaller. For larger properties, it might be bigger. But data shows that we closed the gap in our reassessment. And we took into account the fact that if we raised assessments, it might raise people's taxes too. So it didn't, in some cases, the assessments did not go all the way up to that 40% gap, but we think it would net out to that. The problem with that, once we finished our reassessment, is that there's a whole other body that does appeals called the Cook County Board of Review. They reversed some of that progress we made in making up the gap. So in most communities, some of the gap was closed, but not as much as should have been closed because the Cook County Board of Review made some cuts to commercial properties. And we see the values differently from what they do. And sometimes we try to understand how they get to their numbers. And we think we both should be cooperating using common data sets, common methods, so that we're getting answers that are closer to the values that are being paid in the market. But that was a great question because we saw the same trend in 2020, where again, we closed that gap on commercial properties. Some of the gap was opened up again by the appeals done by the Cook County Board of Review. It differed from community to community. It was frustrating to us to see in some of the western suburbs, like in Proviso, especially in Proviso Township, some communities actually had homeowners shouldering more of the burden than they started out with because the cuts to commercial were so large by the Board of Review. But in most South suburban communities, that closure of the gap did obtain even after the appeals process by the Board of Review. And so that's why property tax bills for the average homeowner fell for about half of South suburban homeowners. Either fell or was flat.
for those properties, commercial properties that uh, were able to pay less tax because of the Board of Appeals ruling, then you said that then those taxes would be the homeowners would have to shoulder the burden of those taxes, but they already received their assessment. So what you're saying is that even though their assessment is low, but the pie among the homeowners that they have to pay because the commercial property owners that had to pay were able to pay less, then their property taxes were still high, even though their assessments were lower than before.
You've explained that very well, and I think you can understand why it's frustrating for us. We came into office, we used these transparent methods, we closed that valuation gap that was documented in a community like Cicero, or a community like Riverside, and we document the commercial data for very big commercial property owners, for like Amazon and Walmart and Target and Kohl's and things like that that are thriving. But then we see the assessments be cut at another level, which transfers the burden back onto homeowners. And of course, poor homeowners don't understand this. In Riverside, for example, residential assessments did not increase, but their property tax bills did, because homeowners' share of that levy grew because commercial property assessments were cut so much at that other venue. So there can be good reasons why those commercial assessments are being cut, but I think they should be explained, just like we explain, how we arrive at our numbers, because it does, these are blue collar people. This is sometimes their only savings that they have, and these are big cuts being made on, in the case of Amazon, the richest person in the world and the most valuable company in America. I think these kinds of things, it's hard for people to understand.
Did Amazon receive a favorable ruling from the Board of Appeals?
Yes, in Cicero, for example, some of the biggest cuts were made to Walmart, to ExxonMobil, to Amazon, and so this is hard for us to understand. There can be good reasons for it. I just think they should be explained, because there is more burden being put onto the homeowner, by this appeals board.
So the Board of Appeals doesn't explain in the ruling, but are the documents which the lawyers of Amazon, ExxonMobil, etc., are those documents that they submit to the Board of Appeals open to the public? Can the public see how those the lawyers argued on behalf of their clients?
I believe that the public could obtain those documents, but you either have to file a FOIA request, or for example, we at the assessor's office have never seen a decision that explains how they arrive at their valuation. So you would think that we would be able to find this out, but I think you have to go and file a Freedom of Information request each time. And I can't speak to them. I think you should ask them for what kind of information they make available.
Mm-hmm. And then also, you mentioned earlier that homeowners, the ones that have the more expensive properties, were able to pay less tax, but those that have the properties that have less value, they had to pay more tax. Is it on account of the more wealthy homeowners having access to an attorney to file an appeal, and then getting their assessment reduced because of their appeal?
There are several different layers of what I'd call deep inequity in our property tax system. The one that we can address at the assessment, in the assessment part of the system. Remember, there are two different parts of the system. There are the assessments, which divide up the levy or the bill amongst all the property owners in the area. And then there's the amount of taxes that have to be raised. That's the other issue. So on the assessment side of the equation, the key is to make sure that there are no distortions in the assessments. Assessments are supposed to match market values. But what can happen, how our assessment system gets distorted, is when people who have money and power and access can either manipulate data or make sure that some data is not available to us, or can file appeals so often that they reduce their share, and then everyone else has to make up the difference. That is the kind of inequity that happens in the property tax system. And we have been working very hard to eliminate that distortion. So how do we do that? We find better sources of data. We make sure that there are not biases or favoritism in terms of access or valuation methods. And we post all our methods so that people can see how we're arriving at our numbers. That is one of the ways that it can be introduced, but we're only the first level of several different layers of appeals in our system that we don't control. And we're still finding that other appeals bodies are cutting assessments in ways that we don't understand, that tend to put more of the burden back onto the homeowner. And that some of those examples I mentioned, you know, in my home community of Oak Park, the biggest building here was an apartment building that was purchased for $100 million by Goldman Sachs. And they filed documents with the SEC saying it was worth $100 million. And our local school board agreed with our valuation of $90 million after taking into account the effect of COVID. But on appeal at another venue, it was cut to $58 million. And that transferred more burden onto other homeowners. And we see lots of other cases like that. So that is one case where we all need to be working off of better data and have methods so that the results are that there are fewer distortions, that our valuations are at market values rather than far away from them. So that's one. But the deeper inequity that I think assessments cannot address is how schools are funded. Because if in Illinois, we are in a system where schools are on their own, school districts are basically on their own for raising their own revenue through property taxes to fund the education of children, that is naturally going to produce a huge inequity where the communities where they don't have much property value, where house values are low, where commercial property is not as big a part of the base, those communities will automatically, structurally have higher rates, regardless of how we do assessments. That is a deep, deep inequity. And the way it needs to be, the reason why it exists is that our state is dead last in the United States for helping to absorb the cost of education in school districts. Our state only provides about 25% of the funding that school districts spend, versus in most states, it's closer to 50%. We need at our state to be providing more support to schools so it doesn't lean so heavily on homeowners to fund them and create that inequity. Federal government can be doing more too. They provide 5 to 10% of the revenues of school districts. That spending has been stalled for a long time. To the credit of the President Biden, they proposed doubling that spending this year, which could make a really big difference, especially in communities in the south and western suburbs where rates are high. But those are addressing education funding is how we address that deepest inequity of communities with low property values. They ended up having the highest rates because of that school funding unfairness.
Yes, we did hear that Englewood had a big increase of what they had to pay in assessments. Is that correct?
That actually in Englewood, that should not be correct, because Englewood's in the city of Chicago. So Chicago has a very broad, diverse base. So it does not have that problem in the sense of you don't have a base, so rates are structurally high. Rates are actually pretty low in Chicago compared with all of the suburbs. But where we see that these really deep inequities are in the western suburbs. For example, if you live in Maywood or Bellwood, where the Proviso School District is, or if you live in the south suburbs in Thornton Township, for example, where Harvey is, or other communities, those are places where there is very little property tax base, but they rightly want to fund the education of their children just at a normal level. And so that automatically creates high rates. The inequities in the city of Chicago are different. It's because of undervaluation of commercial properties, homeowners end up, third-party studies have shown that homeowners have been paying too large a share of the pie, the levy. And then the other inequity, of course, is where does our Chicago public schools decide to spend the dollars that they do raise? And when I talk to people in Englewood, they say, hey, the assessment system in the past has been over assessing us, but then we don't get the resources from the city that we've paid into. And those are, those are decisions that are made in governmental bodies about priorities. And people in Englewood rightly say that we should be getting more of a share of our tax dollar being kept here in the community.
In other words, the people in Englewood say that the tax dollars that they are paying into the levy is being used in other neighborhoods.
That's right. And this is what politics is about, right? Priorities. Where are you spending your money? And do you feel like the people who are spending your money are giving you the value for the money that you're putting in? I think this is these complaints are rightly voiced. And I know there have been attempts to make sure that more resources are put back into communities like Englewood. What we can do at the assessor's office is make sure that we are not over assessing Englewood. So this year, we've made sure that in the assessment process that we're not over assessing the folks in Englewood, but just as important for people in Englewood is to know that other areas of the city that have been under assessed before are going to be properly assessed this year, so that people in Englewood are not picking up the tab for other people who are under assessed elsewhere in the city. That's really important. All of our assessments are interconnected. When you live in Chicago, if you live in Englewood, you can't only think about how am I treated as someone who lives in Englewood. You have to think about, well, what is the assessment process working as it should elsewhere in the city, so that I'm not picking up the tab for other places that are under assessed. So this is really the mission of our administration, is to eliminate those distortions so that everyone is treated fairly. And what it's resulted in is low growth or reduction in property tax bills. So actually the average Chicagoan this year had a lower property tax bill. The average homeowner, the median homeowner in Chicago had a lower property tax bill this year. Our assessments continue this year, but we expect the trend that has happened in the last 2 years, where homeowners are footing a smaller part of the total bill, will continue.
Are you able to provide those figures for the, you said that your office addressed the distortions, so you're trying to eliminate those distortions, so you could actually see how much every district, every neighborhood is paying into the levy. So if
that's right.
So if those figures were provided to the people who divvy up that money, then they would see exactly how much every neighborhood paid into the levy, and then how much that neighborhood deserves to get from what they paid into.
Exactly. So we've actually posted a lot of useful information for people who are curious about this. First of all, for the first year of our administration, the 2019 reassessment, people can go to our website, cookcountyassessor.com, and click the off to the left-hand side, there's a cartoon image, and this is from our annual report of 2019. And people can go in there and see how community by community the tax base shifted in our administration. We also report on how our residential assessments really dramatically improved and closed some of the valuation and the equity gaps that had been reported by third parties before. For last year, for 2020, we have published, again, a dashboard where people can see how tax bases changed in each township. And we'll be releasing very soon a similar dashboard where people can see it town by town, by each municipality, and they can see how bases shifted. And I think this is a real eye opener for people, because people can see that the work that we've done reduced homeowners' share of the levy in our phase of the reassessment in every community. And in most communities, that shift remained intact, but in some communities, that that shift that our reassessment provided was not preserved in some communities. In some communities, homeowners ended up have to shoulder more share of the burden after the appeals process was done at the board of review. But these dashboards that we have can show people that. It shows them graphically, it shows them the numbers, and it's a real eye opener so people can see it. You can also see the largest parcels in each community and how those valuations change too.
So if residents, if taxpayers were to go to the website, they could see exactly how much money that their neighborhood is paying into the levy, and they could ask their alderman to help make sure that what money that they have paid in is coming back to them for their schools.
Well, what the dashboard shows is the share of the levy. So what we can show, again, our assessments only show the share of burden. You have to go to the Cook County Clerk's website to get the actual levy by each taxing body. But on our site, you can see what is the share of the burden assumed by different kinds of property owners and how did that change? And you can see that in each community. And you can see that on, it's called the data dashboard. If you go to our website at cookcountyassessor.com, you can go to the data dashboard and see that.
We've had questions over the years about some residents that they see that their property has been assessed at a certain value, and then they're worried about appealing to the Board of Review or first appeal to your office, because they're worried that if the assessment goes lower, then they won't be able to sell their property at any price higher than the assessed value. Could you help answer those questions?
Well, yes, this is it's understandable why people might think that, but people have to remember that when a lender is looking at your home, they will come up with their own calculation of value and what they're willing to lend against. And there are appraisers that you'll have to follow a certain standard to give that to you. Now, there's been lots of research showing that some of those appraisers may be biased. They may have methods that need to be improved, but that is done separately from our work, where we have our own assessment professionals, our own models doing them. And it is possible that appraisers might look at our assessments to decide how much to lend, but I don't think that's a common thing. I think people, when they're looking at their assessments, should see, does my assessment reflect the market value of my home or not? And if they see us estimating the value of their home to be much higher than they know they could sell their home for, they should be appealing that and bringing that to our attention, because then your assessment is too high. Like I mentioned, like any assessor's office, when you have only 230 people or so trying to estimate the value of almost 2 million very distinct, unique properties that homeowners know better than we do. I always remind our team that we need to walk humbly, because it's always possible that we can be off the mark because we don't have enough information, especially about the interior and quality and character of people's homes that might not have been renovated. It's possible our data might be wrong. It's possible there might be other factors that we're not observing that can depress the value in the market that we might not see. And so that's why the appeals process exists, to highlight those situations, to correct them. And you get multiple different venues to have your case be heard by us and the board of review in Cook County. You also have other venues, the circuit courts and the Illinois Property Tax Appeals Board, called PTAB, and they're all there to be a safeguard, a backstop in case there's a situation where you feel like you have not been treated fairly. And the appeals process is for cases just like that. So we don't want to discourage people from mentioning that, because it's the thing that is 100% for sure is that a homeowner knows their house better than we do. And it's always possible that we can be off the mark because we don't have some key information.
Sometimes the homeowner might see that they might be able to sell for more than what they're assessed for. However, for similar properties, with their characteristics, they might be assessed more than their fellow property owners. So they could still appeal because because similar properties are not are assessed lower, so they could still appeal for a lower assessment so that they could pay less taxes, right?
Well, there are definitely people who, no matter how low their assessment is, even if they know it's below market, they will try to find a reason or a legal argument to reduce it further. And that's understandable from the perspective of the property owner. What we try to do, our mission is to use every available means and analysis and source of data that we have so that those situations do not arise. Because anytime that there's an underassessment of one person's property, you have to remember that that poor person in Englewood, the modest homeowner, the struggling business elsewhere, is footing the bill for those folks who are underassessed. So we really are trying to, like I said, the mission of our administration is to eliminate those distortions, which can disserve the people of the most humble means. So we want to make sure that we are really focused on eliminating those distortions and making sure that we have good data so that we're a good mirror to the market. We don't want that mirror to be distorted, but it's understandable when distortions are there that other people will try to use them to their own purposes. And that's why distortions are bad. We don't want that to happen because that just enhances inequity.
How were you able to find these different methods toward better data? Were they based on models from somewhere else, or did you have someone help, some firm or some data experts helping you find the better data?
Great question. I'd say there's kind of two different orders of problems to eliminate distortions. First of all, sometimes the modeling method builds in a bias which should not be there. What we found out in the past is that our assessments might have been using broad averages, for example, dollars per square foot for different kinds of property on the south side. And if you use a broad average to assess both residential and commercial property on the south side, what you'll end up doing is probably over assessing the lowest valued homes and the lowest valued commercial properties. And what may happen is you may up under assessing the largest and most valuable properties because you're assuming everyone's average. That's what you should not do. So what we've done is we use modeling methods that look more carefully at location than past modeling methods have, and that are much more sensitive to the different variables that might cause one person's home or business to be valued differently from one that could be nearby. And that could be year of construction, that could be proximity to a highway or being present in a certain school district. But we feel like and the data shows that we've eliminated a lot of those modeling distortions that were there before we came into office, and have eliminated a lot of those. That's what the data shows. We're within industry standards in most of the suburban townships that we reassessed, whereas before we were not. And we expect when we reassess Chicago this year, again, the majority of areas where we're doing reassessments, we expect to be within industry standards. In the past, they were not. The other kind of problem, which is a more difficult problem, is the characteristics that are not observed, that we don't see, that are hard to see. For example, the things inside someone's home, whether it has been renovated in the last 50 years or not. We might not know that. We might not know if a kitchen is new or not. We might not know if a basement has been renovated or not, or if it has a mold problem or a problem with the smell. These things that can affect the value of a home are sometimes not observed by us. And when we value a home, we can get it within about $30,000 plus or minus, but on a $100,000 home, that is a pretty big variability that we don't want to have. And that's often driven just by the interior character of the home. The other problem, which is thorny for us, is that the characteristics that we think we know about homes may be inaccurate. That we think a home has 1,000 square feet when it actually has 2,000 square feet. And if that 2,000 square foot home sells, to our model, it would look like the dollar per square foot was double actually what was paid, because what we thought was maybe $1 million house that sold for for $1,000 a square foot for $1,000 home actually was only $500 a square foot, because it actually had 2,000 square feet. So we're really trying to invest in our field team and other sources of data to correct for those data that are not accurate. And then I guess lastly, I'd add that on the commercial side, we're just trying to incorporate new sources that we might not have had before about building incomes and expenses that can also reduce that distortion that we were talking about.
Well, income and expenses were particularly relevant during the pandemic.
You are exactly right. For commercial property, the pandemic, it was really a devastating impact, both for income and expenses, not to mention occupancy. So imagine you own a small strip mall on the south side of Chicago. When you have the impact of COVID and all the subsequent events, your costs probably went up because you're trying to take precautions for COVID, maybe precautions for security. Your costs are going up because maybe your tenants can't pay rent or can't afford to pay rent, or you had to make accommodations for them. And then at the same time, you have on the income side, on the rent side, you may be losing out on new tenants. Some tenants may have to leave or may be struggling, or the rent that you can charge is much lower than it was before because of difficulties. And we see this even in the areas that have traditionally been considered some of the highest end retail areas. Think of the Magnificent Mile. There are a lot of businesses that have been struggling to get people to move into spaces, so they've had to lower rents. So the COVID has had really a dramatic impact on all the things that drive the income of a commercial property. Now, it is very different from property to property. Some kinds of properties have been really hurt. Think about hotels, think about malls, think about performance spaces or bars or restaurants. But some have been thriving. Think of grocery stores or data centers. Self-storage, industrial space has been doing pretty well. So the impact has been very different from property type to property type. But the important thing is that we be able to measure it. We've worked really hard to get the best third-party data that we can obtain for this. We have also worked really hard in the legislature in Springfield to create a modern data collection system like our peers have in the rest of the United States, to have better be able to take a pulse of where the system is today, and to have a good view on even the most modest properties, because sometimes those are hurt the most by the impact of situations like COVID. Because the most modest commercial properties, these typically have lower rents than average, higher expenses than average, higher vacancy than average. And they're oftentimes not measured well by third-party data. So those kinds of small property owners have been hurt by the tendency for us to be regressive before, because we have trouble measuring it. We're just using averages. We want to have assessments that really can measure their unique circumstances and the challenges that they face and the different markets that they face.
For the current assessments, was your office able to incorporate the effects of the pandemic? Or
yes, we think we have as best we can. So we subscribe to all the commercial sources that are obtainable through subscription that you can get. So we've really brought in to play a lot of different sources that were not available before. And we can measure the impacts in different ways. And sometimes we don't have enough information that we would traditionally use in an assessment. For example, the thing that you want most is to have a transaction that is comparable to the property that you're valuing. If you're looking at a shopping mall downtown, you'd like to have another transaction on a shopping mall nearby. But during COVID, there have not been transactions in some classes like this. So you need to find other ways to do that. So maybe you measure income and expense. There are ways of looking in the financial markets to see how financial market expectations have changed and valuations have changed for portfolios of property like malls. And those are the kinds of things that we will take into account. But yes, this year, when we're reassessing Chicago, we've taken into account the effect of COVID. And actually, we took into account the effect of COVID when we reassessed the south suburbs last year too.
For before COVID, the sales prices of properties, so how important was that compared to how important, I guess when you were talking about transactions, you meant sales of
Yes.
comparable properties. So what's the difference between how important transactions were in the past versus how they are now, maybe percentage wise?
Well, they're always important. So basically the way we look at it is we're trying to measure a market, and there's no better way to measure a market than to see transactions happening, to see sales happening. And so before COVID, there were a lot more transactions happening. And so that gave us data points that we could use. Now, it was not a walk on the beach. In some of these property classes, in some of the neighborhoods, there have always been a shortage of comparable transactions for us to use. And sometimes we have to be careful not to assume that something is comparable when it's not. So that was a challenge that existed before COVID. It's even more difficult after COVID because generally transactions, since the onset of COVID are down in commercial properties. In residential, we saw a lot of strength happening in the second half of last year that we did not see in the first half. So it can be different, things can change. But in terms of, I wouldn't want to think in terms of percentage of importance, but when transactions are happening, that's usually the best standard that we can use as an anchor for assigning values to buildings. If we don't have transactions, there are other things that we can look at that can help, but we really prefer we really would prefer that there are lots of transactions that we can look at to establish a value.
How old are the transactions that you would consider for a present assessment? How far back?
Well, we would look at least 3 years. So because we assess every 3 years in Cook County, we look at least 3 years back. We can look further back just to help establish a pattern. Sometimes if a transaction took place 5 years ago, we can adjust that and say, well, we think the market moved this much in the last 5 years, so the adjusted value for this might be X, Y, or Z. When we look at residential values, we've actually looked back 7 years, but we consider the most recent transactions to be the ones that provide the most information.
Mm-hmm. So your predecessor was not doing that then? He wasn't employing these sorts of methods to come up with a fair assessment?
What I'd have to say is we don't completely know the methods that our predecessor used, but we do know that the residential valuation model that they used was very different, that it had some biases in there. It was not generating good results if we just look at like the output of that. And on the commercial side, there were huge swaths of properties were not even being changed by $1 for over a decade, even when the markets had changed a lot. So, I think it's fair to say I don't understand some of the methods that our predecessor used, but it's also fair to say that we think we're being more rigorous. And they're definitely different and upgraded and refreshed. We're trying to use the state of the art that we have. They could definitely be better, especially if we had better data. We think in terms of models that we're using and methods, we think we are up to date. We definitely want to improve the data that we have that are going into the models. And when you have not good data that goes into models, sometimes that leads to incorrect answers, even with the best models. So it's important that we address both.
And when you say that your office is now within industry standards, what comprises industry standards? Is it the data that's most important for industry standards?
Yes, when I was referencing industry standards, I was talking specifically about residential assessments. And there are three different measures that people look to as sort of the key indices of, are you meeting industry standards? The first one is, are they sufficiently accurate? So that would be, are your values that you're estimating, on average about at the level that things are transacting? And so we are within that in most of the suburban areas that we've reassessed, and we're confident that when we reassess in the city, we'll also be within those bounds. The second standard is they surround equity. There are different ways of measuring equity, and especially we think about vertical equity, which is vertical equity is if it's a low-end home, if it's a low-priced home or a high-priced home, is there any tendency to bias? Are lower-priced homes more likely to be overassessed than underassessed? And in most of the suburbs, not all of them, but in most of them, we are now within the industry standards on that measure, which is really good. And then also, we want to make sure that there's not too much variability in our estimates, that there's so much error above and below. And we're, again, in most suburban townships now, we are within those industry standards, whereas before we were not there. So when you look at the residential models, you want them to be accurate. You don't want too much error, and you don't want biases, especially with respect to equity. And on all those areas, we are hitting the marks. We can always improve. And in the areas where we're not meeting them, we think those are largely due to data, and we need better data.
When you publish the methods on how you arrive at the data, do you receive a lot of questions from the public and from users of the site about that information?
Yes, we do, and we love that engagement. We think transparency is not only good in its own right, but it's also good because it makes us accountable and it helps us improve. When we're showing our methods for how we're assessing different kinds of property in different kinds of neighborhoods, it helps us to highlight areas where, for whatever reason, we're still missing the mark. And then we can drill down on the assumptions that we made. And it's not just us, it's the public. The public can say, hey, why do you have this pattern in this neighborhood? Or why do you have this sort of pattern for this other kind of property? And that can help us to drill down and get better and better, and sort of focus our attentions and resources on improving those things. For example, in some neighborhoods where we see too much error or too much variability above or below around the average, sometimes we can say, well, we don't think we are measuring characteristics right here. Let's send our field team out to update the measurements that we have on buildings, or let's look at some of the imagery that we have to make sure that there aren't any discrepancies between our data and what photographic imagery shows. So those are some of the things that we can do to drill down and improve by having the public engage with us. The public has helped us to highlight all sorts of situations where the model is generating illogical answers. And sometimes that is also a result of not having good data going in. For example, I was talking to a homeowner a couple of weeks ago who lived on a block with identical bungalows, and most of the bungalows on his block were assessed in the same way, around, I think it was around $350,000, but his was $430,000. And he said, your model is not working for me. Why is my bungalow assessed so much more than everyone else? And it turned out our model thought he had a finished attic and a finished basement and a larger garage when he didn't. But that's an example where we can drill in and make improvements by the public poking around and looking at things. And that's why we think transparency is good, because it helps us get better and it makes us accountable. And I think it also builds reassurance that we're actually using the model that we say we are.
Mm-hmm. So for that homeowner, you were able to adjust his assessment at your office's level.
And not only adjust the assessment, but also adjust the characteristics of his house, so we didn't make the same mistake a few years later. We've talked to lots of homeowners who've been incredibly frustrated that they feel like they have to bring to our attention every time we reassess it some error, but they weren't corrected before. And one of the reasons why that might have happened was that we used to have many different kinds of systems that did not talk to each other, that were very old, 40 years old in some cases. And this year we've completely replaced that old system of record with an entirely new system that's much more updated. And in the case of this homeowner, I was really happy because we were able to send a screenshot of the changed characteristics in the system, because to him, it was, yes, the assessment being off was annoying, and he wanted to appeal it and he wanted it lower. But the thing that made him mad was that he tried to change this characteristic before, and he kept on having to do it again. And so, this work that we're doing, the IT side, is make sure that when people bring that to attention, we can actually change the characteristic so we don't make a mistake again.
This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. We have just a couple of more questions, and we have with us Cook County Assessor Fritz Kaegi. Thank you so much for joining us. When the people question the methods, and then so this was one example of how you were able to help directly a homeowner. Do you have any other examples of how a resident, or maybe even a business owner, was able to bring something to your office's attention, and then even the methods were changed?
Yeah, sure. So for example, when we reassessed Evanston in 2019, we were using what we thought was the best commercial data that we had to reassess retail properties in Evanston. But that commercial data that we had, we knew in general that it could be more representing what's going on with the larger, more institutional properties. And we have a sense that the smaller properties experience is a little bit different. But then we got an appeal from a small retail property owner in Evanston who said, look, you really overassessed me. And as part of the appeals process, he submitted his rent roll and the expenses that he had to pay on the property too. And then when we looked at it, we saw that, okay, we estimated the rent properly, and we estimated, so we got that right. But what we didn't get right was the expenses, because his building was smaller and older, and it just generally had higher expenses. It was not a professionally, institutionally run larger building. It had higher ongoing expenses to manage the building. And so that made the building less profitable than we thought. And then when we found out that crucial information, then we could lower the assessment. But so how do we change our methods? So first of all, we're really focused on making sure that we look into how much less profitable are these small commercial properties than the bigger ones. This is like a big question for us. We want to classify properties into different categories so that the smaller categories can be assigned higher expenses, which they typically have. We also created a process so that property owners could submit to us information about their expenses before we start the assessment process. This is called the Real Property Income and Expense Form. Starting in 2020, we sent this form to every single commercial parcel owner in the area, in that area that we were reassessing, so in the south suburbs last year. And then in Chicago, we did the same thing. Participation rates are growing, they're still low, but it behooves small businesses, small commercial property owners, to get us that information before we reassess it, so you don't have to have your appeal. You might not need to appeal at all, or if you are appealing, at least it starts out at a level that represents some of the basic data that's out there, because when you appeal, you have to fill out this form anyway. So we encourage people to give us the information before we start the assessment. That can lower your costs, lower your uncertainty from the get-go, and hopefully gets you to a proper assessment from the first instance. So that's an example. That's the kind of situation that shows us, hey, we really need to focus on these problems. Here's some answers that we have. That this is ultimately a reason why we've sought passage of the data modernization bill in Springfield, which would create an anonymized data collection system, much like our peers have in the rest of the country, so that we'd have a good view on this every year that would have broad participation.
That means the respondents would be anonymous when they submit their income and expense report to you.
That's right. So for example, in Evanston, for that small property owner, what we do is we'd have the commercial property owners in Evanston participating, and then different kinds of properties would be grouped into different bins. So smaller commercial properties would be submitting their income and expense information. It would be anonymized, so that we would group them all together. And for small properties like that property owner, like that property that I mentioned, there might be, we want to have in these bins, enough so that it's not identifying any one property owner. So maybe 10 of the retail properties that are most like that person's property. What are the average rent per square foot and cost per square foot for those buildings? What's the average occupancy? And then we get to a much better assessment at the outset for those kinds of properties while maintaining anonymity. And that's, we want to, meet that need, because right now when people appeal, their information is not anonymous. But if we had this data collection procedure in place, that would be anonymous, and then people would have all the rights to appeal that they had before as well. But we'd be starting out at a better point and saving people money.
So the pushback against reporting income and expenses was on account of some business owners not wanting the competition to know. So right now, are they required to submit that information, or is it still voluntary?
Well, I wouldn't want to characterize necessarily their opposition to collecting the data as that they don't want their opposition or competitors to know. An important motive for at least some of the biggest property owners is that they think they are better off by us not having the information at all. They think that they win by us being kept in the dark. They can work the appeals process better when there's no standardized public authoritative data on income and expenses. And that gives them some excuses to argue for lower valuations. So I think that some of the biggest property owners want to thwart data collection because they think they win from us being kept in the dark. So I think that's first. Property tax appeals lawyers who specialize in making appeals, they profit from us being kept in the dark, because to correct all these errors, they have to do it through the appeals process, and they make money on that. So we have to remember that there's some people who like the system broken, and that's why they oppose any change or modernization to it. But when someone appeals to our office, they do have to follow the rules of making an appeal. So you have to provide income and expense information from your property when you appeal to our office. That is helping us to improve. It would be much better to have that information submitted to us before the assessment process starts. That's why we send out these forms, which are voluntary. We get a low amount of participation, but it's rising and it's helpful. And the people who do it, I think, are glad that they did, because they start out with us having better information than not. So I hope that answered your question. I think that got to the question you asked.
Yes, it does. I was just, it just entered my mind that what if their income and expenses that they respond to do not jive with what they report on their taxes? There's no way for you to know, but might that happen?
Well, actually, as part of the appeals process, you actually have to submit your tax form. Your federal income tax form, or at least some of the key fields when you do that. As part of the data modernization framework bill, you wouldn't have to submit your tax form, but you would have to submit some of the data from that form, and would be subject to audit.
And so getting back to Exxon and Amazon, those who appealed, so for those, the lawyers, for when they filed the appeal, then it would be in that appeal, their income and expenses as well, right? For Amazon and for ExxonMobil.
That's right. If they appeal to our office, that's true.
Mhm.
But some commercial properties may decide not to appeal to our office. They may appeal at another venue, like the Board of Review instead. And then, but if they did appeal to our office, that information would be a public record and we would have it, yes.
But what about if they appeal to the Board of Review? Then that information will not be made public?
Well, it could be, you'd have to ask them on the rules that they have for that. And as I understand, when you appeal to those offices, their rules state that you have to submit it. I don't know the degree to which they enforce that.
Could you give us just a little bit of insight on the appealing to the circuit court and PTAB? And would that be applicable to residential homeowners?
Yes, well, residential homeowners do have recourse to the circuit court or to the Illinois Property Tax Appeals Board if they want to appeal. The trouble with that is that if you appeal to the Illinois Property Tax Appeals Board, there is a huge backlog there of many years. The Property Tax Appeals Board is still handing down cases from 2010 and 2011 and 2012. And so it can take a long time to have your case be heard. From the point of view from all of us, from the general public, these venues are, it's yet another bite at the apple for people who might have won appeals before, who are continuing to try to whittle away their share of the burden and push it more onto others. The trouble with the PTAB, the Illinois Property Tax Appeals Board, and the circuit court is when appellants win their appeal there, the taxing body, so your school district or your village, they have to cough up the cash from the amount of property tax that was over collected. And this is draining a lot of cash out of our taxing bodies here in Cook County. It's over $100 million a year now. It's grown at a 20% annual compounded rate since the early 2000s. That is becoming a real ticking fiscal time bomb, considering the size of the backlog and how much more refunds are in store to drain cash from our schools and our villages, which are not in the greatest financial condition in many cases.
Mm-hmm.
But from the point of view of the homeowner, yes, these are areas where you can make appeals. Just know that the backlog is large.
Mm-hmm. And that's after your office, Cook County Assessor, and then after the Board of Review.
That's correct.
And does circuit court come first, or does Illinois PTAB come first?
You have a choice. You can pick either route. It's very complex, isn't it? And yes. I wish it wasn't. We have more venues for appeals than any other state, and it's very frustrating from my point of view, because we're the one office that's concerned about equity for mm-hmm. everyone, rather than hearing appeals from certain narrow parties. Mm-hmm. And when we see appeal after appeal after appeal happening at different levels, it only makes the system more inequitable, because the people who tend to appeal at the later stages are only the wealthiest, only the biggest, and they're whittling down their share. And there's already been a couple chances to hear an appeal before at our office and the Board of Review. These later stages, I think, are really just increasing inequity and draining cash from our taxing bodies while not producing much fairness or justice. At the certain first level of appeal, you are advancing fairness, but I think people have realized that the more levels of appeals you have and the more appeals you have in the aggregate now, the more unequal you make the system.
Mm-hmm. And then when you say that it's draining cash from the levies, so that means that if those business owners' taxes are reduced, then do the homeowners have the other taxpayers have to shoulder that portion of the levy, or does that?
Yes,
they do.
Yes,
mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, for example, Trump Tower just won a case in Chicago on appeal at the Illinois Property Tax Appeals Board. Our public schools in Chicago and our city had to write $1 million check to to the owners of Trump Tower.
Mhm.
And those that money will be made up by the other taxpayers. So the following year, the public schools and the city will increase their levy to pay for that, and everyone else will have to pay it. And that's why assessments are so important to equity, and making sure that appeals are only adhering to market value standards and not some other standard that is completely astray from market values. That's why we have to be so careful, and it deserves lots of scrutiny. And when we're straying away from market values in appeals and assessments, I think we all owe the public an explanation as to why.
Well, thank you so much, Assessor Kaegi. Do you have any other advice for homeowners and for commercial taxpayers as well?
Sure. This is most relevant for people in Chicago right now because it's the reassessment season. When you get your assessment notice, look and see, have we estimated the market value in line with what you think the market would value your home at, what you could sell it at? If it's far off the mark, like more than 10% off the mark, that to the high end, then you should bring that to our attention and make an appeal. Second of all, make sure that you're getting all of the exemptions that you're entitled to. We administer exemptions at our office. There's a homeowner's exemption for everyone who has their principal residence. The same is true for the senior homestead exemption. Anyone over 65 qualifies for that if it's their principal residence. There's something called the senior freeze, that if your income is under $65,000 a year, adjusted for people in your home, then you can freeze your assessment level, which is a very valuable exemption that's provided by the state that we administer.
So they freeze it when they reach 65, whatever the assessment is, when they are at 65, that's the freeze?
Yes, it would be frozen at that level. That's right. Mm-hmm. And furthermore, if there are some years when you were entitled to an exemption, but it was not in place, you can actually apply for it retroactively and have money refunded to you for the amount of tax that you overpaid. That's called a certificate of error. So these are things that can save everyone money, that everyone should try it, and they can read about it on our website at cookcountyassessor.com. The last thing I wanted to note was that a change in your assessment does not entail the same change in your taxes. The reason why is that in our state, assessments are only one part of the equation. If other people's assessments are rising at the same amount that your assessment does, that means your share of the levy is not changed. And so almost certainly if your assessment goes up while other people's assessments are going up, your bill will go down, will not go up by the same amount, and it could go down. This is something that we've seen in the last 2 years in the suburbs. And I know in a time like this, when housing prices are rising, that a lot of people are concerned when their assessment rises, but people should follow the picture for how the overall assessments are growing and understand that your tax bill will not go up by the same amount as your assessment does for that reason.
And if people need help with appeals or help with exemptions, where could they go?
They can go to our website, cookcountyassessor.com, and there's lots of information there. Again, you can come to our office if you need help, because you can make an appointment right online at our website, which is a great way to get your work done without having to spend a lot of time in our office. You can call our office at 312-443-7550. And you can look us up on Facebook or on Twitter. We're happy to take questions. If you tried to call us in the past and you had to wait a long time, give us a try again. We've got a call center that is performing really well, low wait times. Give us a try there too.
Thank you so much, Cook County Assessor Fritz Kaegi, for joining us on WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM today. And thank you so much for all your information.
Well, thanks for having me on WZRD today, and thanks today for all the listeners. Take care.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Be safe.
Thanks.